right, well, we're going to be continuing in our series we've been in over the last several weeks called Hands and Feet, Making Jesus Visible. And we've been talking about the different one another statements in Scripture. We've talked about what it looks like to love one another. We've talked about what it looks like to encourage one another. And last week, David brought a message to us about how we bear one another's burdens. And so today we're going to be in week 4, and we're going to be talking about what it looks like to serve one another. I kind of hate David's not here today. He is traveling and is on the road. I don't envy where he's coming from. He's been in Chicago all week, and but I kind of hate he's not here because we're going to be talking about something that he loves and is passionate about, and that's baseball. You probably don't know this, but as a kid when I was growing up, I loved baseball. It was actually probably my favorite sport. Now, maybe not so much. I don't really watch it a lot anymore. In fact, I don't know many of the players, and the ones that I do know are managers now that I remember from my childhood. But I was a huge baseball fan growing up, and I loved baseball. I loved anything related to it. I collected cards. I wheeled and dealed in that, and I loved watching different shows about baseball. I loved watching games, and then back then ESPN did this show. Maybe you guys remember some of you would remember, some of you are not going to remember this because it would be before your time, but they had a show that used to come on called Home Run Derby. And it was all these guys like Mickey Mantle, Harmon Killebrew, just different, Ted Williams, different guys. And the whole premise was to see how many home runs they could hit. But there were also some really great pitchers in that time as well. There was guys like Sandy Koufax, there would have been, let's see, some of the other ones. Not only Sandy Koufax, you had, Bob Gibson would have been one. You had Tom Seaver, or some names. Nolan Ryan got his start in the 60s. And then there's just a bunch of others. But there was one pitcher that maybe you're familiar with and maybe you've never heard of. But it was a gentleman by the name of Bob Feller. And Bob Feller pitched for the Cleveland Indians back in the day. And this would have been in the 40s. And when Pearl Harbor was bombed back then, one of the Americans who volunteered to serve our country was this pitcher named Bob Feller. Bob was a 23-year-old pitcher at that time for the Cleveland Indians. He was a phenomenon who had already pitched a no-hitter and won 107 games in the major leagues at that point. Bob was reaching his peak years as an athlete, but he gave those years up to shoot down planes in the Pacific in that theater of World War II. When he returned to baseball after serving his country, Bob went on to throw 3 more no-hitters, 12 one-hitters, and he won 266 games. But his years of military service, during which he could have won another 80 to 100 games, cost Bob much of the fame that he deserved. When baseball fans selected the All-Century team in 1999, Bob and his 266 victories were ignored in favor of 2 other pitchers. Some suggest Feller may be the most underrated baseball player of all time. Feller was once asked if he regretted his wartime service. He said, "No, I've made many mistakes in my life, but that wasn't one of them." Now, I share this story with you to illustrate a point we're going to talk about. So for Bob Feller, there was a cause greater for him to participate in rather than focusing his time and attention and effort on his individual pursuits. There was a cause, a mission that was greater, and that cause that was greater, that mission that was greater was him serving his country in wartime. And he gave up and laid down his individual pursuits for the greater good of his country. And I share that because that's going to illustrate where we're going to go today as we talk about what it looks like to serve one another. He considered others were more important than himself. See, he could have stayed and he could have pitched and he could have played in Major League Baseball all those years and probably padded his stats, and no doubt he would have been even more incredible than he already was. But yet there was something that was a cause that was greater than that. And so I want to get us to give some serious consideration to a few questions as we start today before we jump into our text. And here is these questions. Number one, how do we view serving others? So let's ask some things about that. How do we view serving others? Do we view that through the lens of duty and obligation, that it's something we have to do? Do we view it as something that we're earning God's favor, or somehow we're making God love us more? Or do we view it as something we do to tip the scales more in this way so we have more good works than we do bad works? Is that how we view serving? Do we view serving maybe as something that is beneath us? Do we view serving as something we just maybe don't want to do? Like, I'm not really that interested in doing that. That's just not really something that would appeal to me. Or do we view serving as a privilege and something that we are commanded by Jesus to do? It is a command from Jesus, as we're going to see, but it's also a privilege that we get to serve. And if we look at it that it's a privilege, then it doesn't become like I deserve it. It doesn't become that it's owed to me. It doesn't become a burden or something that I really don't care anything about doing, or something that I think is beneath me. We look at it totally different. When I get to do something and I get to be involved in it, there's a spirit of humility. And there's something about it that just, it humbles us. But let's keep these questions in mind as we jump into John chapter 13. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 17. And we're going to focus on this aspect of what it looks like to serve one another. John chapter 13, beginning in verse number 1, the word of the Lord says, "Before the Passover festival, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now when it was time for supper, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray him. Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands, and that he had come from God, and that he was going back to God. So he got up from supper, laid aside his outer clothing, took a towel and tied it around himself. Next he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, and to dry them with the towel tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who asked him, 'Lord, are you going to wash my feet?' Jesus answered him, 'What I'm doing you don't realize now, but afterward you will understand.' 'You will never wash my feet,' Peter said. Jesus replied, 'If I don't wash you, you have no part with me.' Simon Peter said to him, 'Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head.' 'One who has bathed,' Jesus told him, 'doesn't need to wash anything except his feet, but he is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you.' For he knew who would betray him. This is why he said, 'Not all of you are clean.' When Jesus had washed their feet and put on his outer clothing, he reclined again and said to them, 'Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are speaking rightly, since that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done for you. Truly I tell you, a servant is not greater than his master, and a messenger is not greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." Now, before we work our way through the text today and talk about this, there's one thing that I want us to keep in mind as kind of an overall thing about serving one another, and it's this: serving one another in a spirit of humility is one of the ways we demonstrate to others we are following Jesus. So serving one another in a spirit of humility is one of the ways that you and I demonstrate to others around us that we are following Jesus. And Jesus said, as we talked about in the first week, that your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. But also we're going to see that as we serve one another in this way that Jesus has served the disciples, it testifies as well that we are following him. And so let's talk about that today and what that looks like to serve one another. Number one, we have to understand that Jesus' love for us is the basis for us serving others. That Jesus' love for us is the basis for us serving others. In fact, in verse number 1, we see that it says about Jesus having loved his own who were in the world. It says he loved them to the end. As Jesus is getting ready to return to the Father, that says having loved his own, he loved them to the end. It tells us this first and foremost before it tells us what Jesus did for the disciples. It tells us of his love for his followers. And so Jesus' love for us has got to be the basis for everything. It's what motivates us. In fact, Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians, that it's the love of Christ that compels us, that motivates us, that moves us, that calls us to action. So if someone were to ask you right now, what is your motivation? Why do you serve other people? Why do you do the things that you do in regards to serving? How would we answer that question? Would we say, well, I do it because I just have a love for people? Would we say I do it because, well, I do it because I try to be a good person? Maybe we do it because, well, I just feel like it's the right thing to do. And like I've shared with you guys before, if our motivation is anything but Jesus' love for us, it makes it extremely difficult for us to stick with that. Because if I just do something because I love other people, eventually they're going to do something that makes me mad, and I'm not going to probably love them as much anymore. Like if I'm going to be like, man, you know, I'm having a really hard time loving you right now because you're just getting on my nerves. Like, let's be honest. And if Jesus' love for us is not the basis, then it's really easy for us to fall into that trap of, well, you know, like you're just annoying me, so like I'm just not going to do that. But this act of service by Jesus, it demonstrated the love that he had for his disciples that he's getting ready to do. And if we have any other motive than this for serving others, it's not going to work. Because eventually we will get tired, we will get burned out, we will just fall away from it if anything else but this is our motivation. But when Jesus' love for us, and it saturates our hearts and our lives, and the only way this happens, guys, is we are in God's word and we're reading scripture and we're reading the narrative and the story of God and what God has done for us. And as we read all these things, the love that he has for us, it should overwhelm us. And when we allow that love to saturate our hearts and our lives, there's no way we can respond in any other way but joyful obedience, as we've talked about before. And serving others is part of that. Loving others is part of that. Bearing others' burdens is part of that. Encouraging others is part of that. But it has to start with the basis of Jesus' love for us. And so that's the foundation when it says that his love for them was to the very end, that he loved them up until the end. But there's another thing that we need to consider when it comes to serving one another. The second thing is this. No one is above serving and no one is below being served. No one is above serving and no one is below being served. Look at verses 2 through 5 that we just read. It says, now when it was time for supper, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray him. Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands, that he had come from God and that he was going back to God. So he got up from supper, laid aside his outer clothing, took a towel and tied it around himself. Next, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to dry them with the towel tied around him. Don't lose the weight of what's happening in this scene. Jesus, who is God in the flesh, he is the visible manifestation of an invisible God. The person who created everything, the person that everything was created for, he gets up and after reclining from the table, he takes off his outer garment He ties a towel around his waist and he gets down on his knees and he begins to wash the disciples' feet. So if the creator of the universe, if he humbly served other people in this way, how can any of us act like we have the right to refuse serving others? If Jesus did that, we are not above serving. And let me just say this. This is one of the things that personally is something that's within me, but it's just something we believe at Hope Church as well, that no one is above serving. No one's too good to serve. And in fact, I'm not too good to pick up a toilet brush and go scrub toilets, because if it needs to be done, it needs to be done. I'm not too good to come in here and do something else. And none of us should ever have that mindset that is beneath us. I'm afraid that sometimes we look at things and we say, man, I'm not doing that. I'll tell you, God really humbled me several years ago on this. I was taking a break from ministry in 2016, and honestly wasn't even sure I was ever going to go back into ministry because I was dealing with some serious spiritual burnout. And I knew I was going back into the workforce to get a job that wasn't ministry. And I was going to, be doing the normal thing. And I applied at a bunch of different places, and, what the job market wasn't exactly back then what it is now. And well, lo and behold, about the only thing I ended up with was fast food. I ended up working for several years at Chick-fil-A here in Martinsville. I was probably pushing 40 when I did that. In fact, I was older than the guy who owns the Chick-fil-A here in Martinsville. I was one of the oldest people working there. There was one other person on the team that was older than me. And I can tell you, honestly, that was somewhat of a humbling experience to be almost 40 years old and you're working with a bunch of high school and college kids and you could be their father. And thinking, I never even did that in high school. I had other jobs I did, but that was never one of them. And I can tell you, God used that, because I can tell you, I wasn't too good to do that because my family needed the income. And so it wasn't beneath me to serve the Lord's chicken. It wasn't beneath me to work fast food, even though that season of my life probably had already passed as far as working maybe a job like that. And I found out there's a reason why high school kids and college kids do that, because when you're pushing 40, man, I'm telling you, I'd come home and I'd be like, man, I am dog tired. But we have to understand that if the creator of the universe can humbly serve others that way, we don't have the right to refuse to serve one another. But I want you to notice something else in these verses we just read. Notice that Jesus even washes Judas's feet. Now I want you to think about this one for a moment. He washes Judas's feet, even knowing that Judas is going to betray him. In fact, it even says that Jesus knew that Judas would betray him because he talked about it. And constantly, Jesus knew what was in people's hearts when he would have conversations with the Pharisees and the scribes. Constantly, he would say things to them when they were reasoning in their hearts. And he would say, why are you reasoning in your hearts about this? Now, that would be that would get your attention if you're just thinking something in your mind and then all of a sudden someone goes, why are you thinking that? But Jesus knew what was in Judas's heart. He even knew that he was going to betray him. I loved what one commentator says in his commentary in the Gospel of John. He says, Judas at this point is in league with Satan, but Jesus still stoops before him as a humble servant and slowly washes the caked dirt and grime off his feet. Judas is in full league with Satan at this point, and yet God himself stoops to wash the dirt and the grime off the feet of the very one who would betray him. Here's a question. Let's be honest. What would we have done? Would we have washed Judas's feet knowing that? If we knew someone was going to stab us in the back, if we knew someone was going to betray us, would we still humbly serve them as Jesus just did this act of service for Judas? That's kind of a mind-blowing thing when we think about that. And that's one of the things that really stands out. That Jesus did this for Judas even knowing. And so no one is above serving. And no one is below being served. So if Jesus could serve Judas, who would betray him in this way, there is nobody that is below us serving them. Nobody. Number 3, when we think about serving one another, serving others means we are willing to be inconvenienced for the benefit of someone else. Serving others means we are willing to be inconvenienced for the benefit of someone else. So what Jesus was trying to do here is he kneels to wash the disciples' feet, is he's trying to instill in them this attitude of a servant, an attitude of humility, a willingness to put others ahead of oneself. Now, foot washing is some churches do this as an ordinance still today. And I don't know, there's some of us here, maybe we've participated in foot washings. Maybe we've been a part of that. And some of us maybe have not. And when you hear that, like there's just something within us that thinks, man, that's really weird. Washing somebody's feet, like that's just, man, feet are creepy. Like they're gross. Like why would you do that? Like that's just strange to do that. And so this kind of gets lost on us in our Western culture in 21st century America. But in first century Jewish culture, they totally understood the significance of washing someone else's feet. Why? Because they wore sandals everywhere they went. They didn't have Skechers. They didn't have Hey Dudes. They didn't have Air Jordans. They wore sandals. And everywhere they went, guess what? They walked. And so what happened? Their feet naturally got dirty. They got nasty. They would get dirt caked on. They would be grimy. And so when you entered a person's home, that was their way of showing hospitality to people that were visiting. And people entering into their home was when you walked in, you would wash the dirt off of their feet. And that was a way to serve them. And if you've seen the Jesus Revolution movie, you saw that happen when the hippies were coming in all barefoot, and the old church people there, they weren't happy about it because, well, they might ruin the shag carpet. And so I love what the pastor does. He gets a basin of water, gets a towel, and he starts washing people's feet as they enter the building. And so that was a way of showing hospitality. And so it was a way of serving. And so they would have understood this. It wasn't about just washing their feet. It wasn't about that. It was about humbling yourself. It was about an act of a posture of a servant. Yes. It was about getting down and literally saying, let me serve you in this way. And it's not about the feet. It's not about the washing. Serving others like this, in this manner, takes time and it takes effort. And it requires an attitude of humility. It requires us to understand that others are more important than ourselves. And Jesus constantly was preaching that message that it was always about others. It was never about us. It's about others. In fact, the Apostle Paul, as he's writing to the church at Philippi, he echoes this. Listen to his words of Philippians chapter 2, verses 3-4. He says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interests of others. Paul's echoing this. He's saying that everything we do should be done in a spirit of humility. Don't do it out of selfishness. Don't do it out of conceit. He says, but in humility, consider other people as more important than yourselves. See, our culture is completely flipped that. We live in a culture that says there's nobody more important than number one. And our flesh always believes that as well, that, hey, there's nothing more important than me and fulfilling what I want and doing what I want and making sure that I'm satisfied. Don't matter if you're okay, as long as I'm okay. That's all that matters. And that's what our culture lives. And sadly, we see that permeate into the church as well. now this attitude that it's not about others, but it's about us. And that's completely opposite. In fact, I had this point really driven home to me earlier this week. Someone I know who's a director of missions for an association in the state of North Carolina, they're not here, but around North Carolina, they were sharing about meeting with a dying church. There were about 15 people left. The congregation was predominantly 80 years old and up. That was it. They were dying. And he met with them. And he was talking to them about what they needed to do. They needed to make some changes, and if they were going to see their community reached, if they were going to see, people come to know Christ, if they were going to see disciples made, that there would be some things they'd have to change because what they were doing was leading them to a place of death. And he shared this, said this one lady spoke up, "We're not changing anything." And then everybody just started going, "Yep, that's right. Yep, we're not changing." So what they were saying was, we don't care if our community is not being reached. It's about us. We want to be happy. And that is completely opposite of what Jesus calls us to as his followers. It's not about us. This church is not about us. It doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Jesus. And so it's about him. Everything's always about somebody else. And that's what Jesus is saying. Serving others means that we're willing to inconvenience ourselves for the benefit of someone else. That we're willing to be out of our comfort zone. We're willing to humble ourselves and take a posture of a servant for the benefit of somebody else. And so here's a question for us to ask ourselves. When was the last time that we actually allowed ourselves to intentionally be inconvenienced for the benefit of someone else? If I'm being honest, it's probably been a while, because there are times in my life someone said, "Well, can you do that?" Well, let me think. Man, I don't really want to do that. No, I can't do that, because that wouldn't be convenient for me. I think I need to take a hard pass on that, because, that's just that'd really be out of my way to do that. That wouldn't really fit into my schedule. But when was the last time that we intentionally interrupted our schedule for the benefit of someone else? Jesus calls us to serve in that way, that we're willing to be inconvenienced for the benefit of someone else. Let me give you the fourth thing, the final thing. If we are truly followers of Jesus, there must be humble service in our lives. If we are truly followers of Jesus, there must be humble service in our lives. So this is building up to the end of the passage of chapter 13 that we initially looked at in the very first message that we had about loving one another. And we talked about that if we're truly following Jesus, then we're going to have a love for one another. And Jesus is building up to that. So if we're truly following Jesus, there has to be this humble service of others in our lives. And so the washing of the disciples' feet that Jesus performs is an example of the relationship that Christ expects in us as his followers. Taking the posture of a servant, humbling ourselves, doing something for someone else. See, what Jesus did was actually in Roman culture would have been something only slaves did. A rabbi would not have got down on his knees and done that. That would have been no way. That's beneath a rabbi in that culture. And so Jesus is showing them what true servanthood looks like, what it looks like to follow him in that manner. The washing of their feet was an example of the kind of relationship that he's calling us to today. Meaning that as brothers and sisters in Christ, we are to serve one another in this same manner. That we're to serve even others in this same manner. Why? Because he says, I've given you an example that you should do to others as I have done for you. An example means this is what you're to do. This is how you are to do it. So let's wrap all this up as we close out. See, in the Roman Empire, wealth and power were idolized. Not a lot different than it is today in our culture. We idolize wealth and power, and we think status is something to be achieved and something to desire and to try to attain. How many times do you see people that desire to attain more humility in their life, or they desire to be more of a servant? Very rarely do we see people saying, man, I really want to work on having a greater posture of humility in my life. I want to work on being a greater servant. In fact, our culture is always like, I want to get to the next thing. I want to climb that ladder. I want to attain more status. I want to attain more power, more wealth. That's what our society's predicated on, is this idea of moving up the ladder and attaining more and more and more and getting more and consuming more. But in the Roman Empire, things like pity and humility, they were considered signs of weakness. Our culture doesn't fare much different. We tend to look at humility as more of a weak thing. We tend to look at things like that as something that we should not desire. I tell you, the older I get and the more I'm in ministry, the more I just want to be part of the team, and I want to see God do something. And I just want to be part of that. I don't even care if I'm visibly part of that. I don't care if I'm the one behind the scenes doing it. In fact, the older I get, the more I kind of like being behind the scenes. I like doing the things behind the scenes. I like helping to set things up for people to succeed. And I like being able to help serve people and resource people and equip people. The older I get, the less I really desire to be out front. The younger I was, the more I wanted to do that. But the older I've gotten, I've realized that we can have a greater impact in obscurity, behind the scenes, in the posture of a servant. And we can influence more people doing that than standing up here on Sunday morning. We can have more influence investing in people and equipping people and resourcing people. See, Jesus called his followers to live radically different from the culture around them as they reflected what it looked like to be a citizen of his kingdom. And so what Jesus is calling us to as his followers is a posture of servanthood, a posture of serving one another. Guys, what would it look like if we looked for ways as the body of Christ that we could go out of our way to be like Jesus in this way and to serve others, to put our towels on, to get down on our knees, and to serve one another in this spirit of humility. One of the greatest ways I saw this lived out was a great pastor mentor of mine. We spent 2 years in this church. It was a very large church. It was a mega church in this area. And I'll never forget, I was part of a men's leadership group that he was taking several guys through, and not anybody could be into this. It was like they only had 20 spots open. So once the 20 spots were filled, it was full. And it was just first come, first serve. And so like when I found out about this, man, I like made a beeline to make sure I was one of the first people in it. I wanted to be part of this. And I'll never forget, we concluded this thing by this guy who pastors a church of probably at that time about 1,200 people. Huge staff. I mean, their budget was probably, for salaries, was probably like $2 million for that year, just for salaries. I'll never forget, he had us come up and sit in this chair, and he put a towel, and it had Mark chapter 10, verse 45, the reference written on it. And that says, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And he got down on his knees and he was like this. And he put that towel on us and he says, you have a pastor that loves you and wants to pray for you and is here to serve you. And he began to pray specifically over each guy in that room. And this is what was crazy. I mean, I'm not talking about generic general prayers. I mean, like I'm talking specific things about our lives and about us. And so you know what? That towel, still in my office, some 7 years later. And I keep that towel on my desk with that reference as a reminder. It's not about you. It's about Jesus, and it's about others. And I stare at that towel every day. And I look at that, and it stayed in my house for a long time as well, at my desk there, that I could look at that. And so as we close out today, humbly serving one another in love, it's one of the ways that we can make Jesus visible around us. It's how we can make Jesus visible to one another. It's how we can make Jesus visible to our community. And so here's 2 questions I want to pose, and we're going to be done. And we're going to stand and sing in a moment and have a time to respond. But here's 2 questions. Number 1, how can I serve someone else within our church family this week? How can I serve someone else in our church family this week? So let's intentionally look for a way that every one of us in this room, we can intentionally serve someone else in our church family this week. Because all of us have a gift, have a talent that God has given us. And it's not for us to use for us, but it's for us to use for the greater good of the body, to serve the body, to build up the body. Second question, how can I serve someone in the community this week? So not only how can I serve someone within our church family this week, but how can I serve someone in the community this week? If you're wondering, and you say, well, I really don't have any idea, I can go ahead and throw out an idea right now. I believe it is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's Wednesday. We're going to be going to provide some food for Clearview Early Learning Center. They have open house. So we're going to be providing food for the staff. If you're not involved in that, that'd be a great way you could go and to serve someone in our community. I'll tell you how else you could serve someone else in our community. Maybe it could be by just doing something as simple as a random act of kindness. Maybe it could be something as simple as you're at the drive-thru at Starbucks and you say, you know what, I'm going to grab the person's order behind me and pay for it. And just serve them in that way and just bless them in that way. But those 2 questions we need to ask ourselves. Not only do we need to ask, but we need to act on them. How can I serve someone within our church family this week? And how can I serve someone in our community this week? Because Jesus has given us the example. He says, I have given you the example that you should do unto others as I have done for you. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we got to go and we got to wash someone's feet this week. But I can tell you, if you've never participated in that, it is a humbling thing to do. It's an even more humbling thing when someone does it for you. And I know John and I have had the privilege to be part of things like that, and I think Brandon maybe has, and there might be a few others. It don't have to be that, because it's not about the washing of the feet. It's about the posture of humility and the posture of a servant. So let's all stand. And I pray that we'll respond today as God has spoken to our hearts, and that we would respond in a spirit of humility, and that we would humble ourselves before the Lord, saying, as Isaiah did, here am I, Lord, send me to go serve someone else this week.